Hello everybody and welcome to the week 3 feedback video for maintaining a mindful life. So some really interesting topics and this week mostly dedicated to emotional health and some of the more subtle and challenging topics. And a question arose as to why don't we talk more about emotional health rather than mental health? And you could very much put it in those terms because really the emotions are so important, and they're the big driver really. I mean, thinking is one thing and emotions the other, and the two are sort of very intimately linked, but the terms could almost be used interchangeably. Some interesting, almost philosophical discussions this week about defining the mind, and that certainly kept philosophers and in more recent times psychologists going, as well as consciousness researchers. Now, it just depends on what perspective you come at. If you look at it from a modern material science point of view, the mind is just electrical activity in the brain, chemicals whizzing around, electrical charges moving, and that generates thoughts. If you look at it from maybe a more philosophical, metaphysical point of view, then the body, the brain, is physical, but the mind is a non-physical thing, and then consciousness entirely. And to paraphrase an ancient philosopher, or Renaissance philosopher, not that ancient I suppose, the body's the shadow of the soul. And light, object, shadow, consciousness, mind, body. And so from that perspective, it makes a lot of understanding of mind-body medicine perhaps a little more understandable. That what we give our attention to in the mind has powerful effects on the body. Maybe you've had one or two negative emotions in your time, but some kind of thought, you give your attention to a thought, generates an angry emotion, and you can immediately experience physical changes in the body. You give your attention to a thought, I might do an online mindfulness course, and next thing the body's getting up and it's registering on FutureLearn to do a course. So consciousness, what we give our attention to in the mind, has profound effects on the body. And so in a kind of a way, they're sort of inseparable, but I suppose they're just operating on different levels. So it depends on what angle you come at. I know what angle I come at, but you've got to work out for yourself. But I think that mindfulness, meditation really perhaps gives us a bit of an insight, and at very least it gives us the opportunity to start to use our attention in a more conscious and discerning way. What to give attention to, what not to give attention to. And that's really important from a mental health point of view, because when we give our attention to certain thoughts or emotions, when we give our attention to others, then it'll have effects on the body. So any activity that goes on in the brain certainly very quickly cascades into effects in the body. It's pretty much hard to separate them. A lot of interest in rewiring the brain for happiness, and it's great to see how we can cultivate the kinds of things that we often take for granted, the gratitude and the savouring and so on, and that's perhaps something worth really giving attention to, because if we stop looking, we stop noticing that looking out this window right now, the plum tree's in blossom, and then there's a bird singing outside and so on. So if we stop paying attention, we stop these little receiving these little pleasures, these little moments of beauty in our life. So, and that negativity bias, there's so much of it, and it's fed by the environment and media to keep focusing on negative things, and we often don't see the positive things, the positive changes in life. A question though about, well, do we come into the world neutral or not? I think things always boil down to nature and nurture, not nature or nurture. That is, that we probably come into this world with a particular disposition to look for dangers and threats, but that we're in will emphasise one or the other, and we probably have a little too much negativity bias going on these days, I suspect. Self-compassion's been an important topic, and so many people noticing that it's easy to be compassionate for somebody else, but not compassionate to ourselves. And really with, COVID, and for many people who've been locked down at various times, there's sort of sense that we really do need to cultivate a little bit of self-compassion. We can, in a sense, be our own personal trainer if we do it well. And I think it really starts with a little bit of care and compassion for ourselves. And so many of you are really noticing the value of generating that. Pain's been an interesting and important topic, and a few questions arising. Many of you finding the pain practice, the meditation working with pain, quite useful. I mentioned John Kabat-Zinn's work, and he was a real pioneer in this area. And people were encouraged to practice 30, 40 minutes a day even. In one go, well, normally it was, but could be in 2 goes. I don't think anybody really knows whether practicing 40 minutes in one go is better than 20 minutes, twice a day. I don't think there's really a hard and fast answer in the research that says that one is better than the other. But I guess the point is that when we're working with something that's really, really challenging, like severe chronic pain, then it needs more than perhaps just a few minutes a couple of times a day. Now, mind you, those 40 minutes of concentrated practice, of course, is the springboard to be mindful in day-to-day life. There was a question around whether or not it's a placebo. Is mindfulness a placebo painkiller? Now, anything that's got quite a subjective element to it, pain, emotions, nausea, sleep, and so on, has a very significant placebo effect. Much more so than perhaps other things. So the strong subjective component, you give somebody a placebo, you get a much bigger placebo effect. Give a person a sugar pill, but if they believe it's something that's going to make them go to sleep, or if it's something that's going to wake them up, or something that's going to ease their pain or nausea or something else, then much bigger effect for those things that have quite a strong subjective component. And pain does have quite a strong subjective component. There is the physical sensation, tissue damage, for example, injury occurring. But there's all of the other stuff going on in our mind, our emotional state, our perception, what's happening with our attentional circuits. All of these things can have a massive effect on amplifying the suffering associated with that or minimizing the suffering associated with that. And that's where mindfulness comes in. There's been some interesting research, for example, looking at what goes on in the brain with placebo and what goes on in the brain with mindfulness in terms of dealing with pain. And they're quite different. They're totally different circuits in the brain. And what mindfulness does is that it seems to be something that regulates the gateway about what messages to let through to higher circuits. So it's like if you're really paying attention to something, like in this feedback video right now, there might be other sounds in the background. Now just listen for a moment. Could be other sounds in the background, but you probably haven't been very aware of them. You're not trying to block them out, but because your attention's engaged with one thing, the other things recede into the background. And it seems to work in the same way with pain. So when we learn to be mindful with pain, then as we engage our attention more with our life, who we're with, what we're doing, the pain messages seem to recede into the background. And the other big thing is the reduction in the emotional reactivity to the pain when it's noticed. So if we can notice it and be less reactive emotionally to it, then we don't amplify the suffering associated with it in the way that we do when we notice it and we get irritated and frustrated and so on, because all of a sudden the attention fixates on it and we amplify the experience of it. So it's a very different thing to placebo, and I can give you a link to one particular study that looked at that if you'd like to have a look at it. All right, so that's all for this week. Next week, some interesting topics, choiceless awareness, which will open monitoring practice in meditation, so quite a different style of meditation. Where does mindfulness fit in with ethics and values and so on? And of course, at the end of this course, we want to give you some signposts to help to maintain a mindful life after the course is over. So I look forward to everything coming in during the week. Have a very mindful week, and all the best from me for now.